the practice of interpreting. But let me start by highlighting very briefly the importance of the paradigm shift that took place within linguistics over the last 4 or 5 decades. We actually moved from the investigation of language as a pure linguistic competence to the consideration, the study of language as a cultural, behavioral activity. And it's never enough to emphasize the importance of this paradigm shift in the way we look at language. I think that we need to consider that, to be able to understand how best we can improve the interpreting profession. Let me start very briefly by talking about 3 types of language variation that are relevant to the service of interpreters. I would deal very briefly with language variation as such, stylistic variation, and how both stylistic and linguistic variation are related to social variation. We have grown up in an academic tradition that tried to look at language as a monolithic entity, where variation is kept to the minimum, at least from the attention of academics and language professionals. But recent investigations in sociolinguistics and in linguistics in general have highlighted that language variation is actually the rule rather than the exception. And we need to take that into consideration in the way we describe and the way we explain language phenomena. And one of the ramifications of this monolithic approach to language is to consider language as purely limited to some kind of standard variety. We rarely talk about the degree of variation that is observed in everyday communication, and we tend to look at language as purely a standard language form. We know that's not really the case, and there is a great deal of variation. If we look at, for instance, social variation, we can see that we have, if we can represent this in a pyramid-like form, we can have at the bottom all the non-standard language varieties, and probably at the top we can have one standard variety, the standard language, which originally was a dialect, but through time has become a standard language variety, usually for a number of socio-political, cultural reasons. One dialect makes it to the top and becomes a recognized standard language variety at the expense of all the other varieties. I'm not going to go into the socio-historical reasons that led to the emergence of standard language varieties, but let me focus on the fact that we had to deal with demystifying this definition of language as purely one standard language variety. And we have to look at language as as made up of different forms of speech, different varieties, standard and non-standard language varieties. Actually, the standard language variety itself is just the tip of the iceberg. But if we want to provide a comprehensive, adequate definition of language, we need to go beyond that tip, and we have to consider a broad definition of language that will bring in this dimension of diversity. Stylistic variation is related to the degrees of formality and informality in speech, and they are very much related to this, this linguistic variation dimension, standard, non-standard. The 2 dimensions are related to social stratification and social differences. We have different language varieties because we have different social groups, and these different social groups use language differently and for different reasons. And this may sound obvious to all of us probably today, but it is still a major paradigm shift in the way we study language. Now, let me move very quickly into an attempt to talk about what we mean by a standard language variety. We tend to think of it as also a monolithic entity. We tend to believe that the standard is the standard and it is one single language variety. that is not really the case. When we look at languages around the world, we realize that there are more and more varieties of standards, so to speak. And as indicated by one of our linguists in Tunisia, and I'm going to say this in Arabic, Rashid al-Hamzawi, for instance, talks about al-fusha fasahat. And he says that there is not one standard Arabic, there are standards of Arabic. Now the question is which one to choose, and which one to teach, and which one to use in interpreting, for instance. The question should be addressed, but I don't think that there are easy answers for that. Look, for instance, at the current situation of the English language. And if you look at the publications of Tom MacArthur, particularly one of his books entitled The English Languages, we realize that even English itself is becoming different languages and different standards at the same time. And that's the paradox of the English language. The more it spreads, the less native speakers play a role in it, in determining its standards. And nowadays we have a great deal of regional standards. If we look at the situation of English, for instance, in Africa, we have West African, with the West African variety, the East African variety, the South African variety. And within these varieties, you will find differences still and different substandards, as it were. So the question of standard language itself is really questionable, because we cannot really talk about one single standard language variety. The same applies to Arabic. There are different standards of Arabic, as I said earlier on. And we can broadly talk about North African Arabic, Middle Eastern Arabic, and Gulf Arabic. Experience in the area of interpreting shows that these are not necessarily linguistically definable standards, but I think that to a large extent, in a broad sense, we can talk about these three major standards of Arabic. The same applies to the French language. The French talk about le français régional to refer to different types of French or different varieties of French spoken in Africa and elsewhere, in addition to la variété de métropolitaine, where we have the main standard language variety there. So variation is everywhere, and particularly in the case of English, with globalization, with the emergence of English as a global language, we have more and more diversity and more variation. And that raises the question of the status of these varieties. Should we recognize them as standards in their own right, or should we consider them as cases of educational deficit? So the debate is still going on, but irrespective of the outcomes of this debate, we have a reality, and the reality is diversity and language diversity in all the languages I mentioned. I focus simply on French, English, and Arabic because those are the languages that our students probably will have to deal with most. Now, in dealing with standard Arabic, for instance, when we also standard English, we need to make a clear distinction between the way we write the language and the way we speak the language. And that's why many linguists think that a standard language variety is actually a myth. It's a written myth. It's only when it is written that it is really standardized. But when people start using it, there are so many factors that come into the picture, to the point that we cannot really talk about a standard anymore. And if you take English, as I said earlier on, there are different accents of English, there are different varieties of English, and most of them claim that they are standard English varieties. And they are recognized, at least in their regions, as standards, and they are used. Now, what matters to interpreters is that at the end of the day, they will have to deal with variation. Whether they are against it or in favor, ideologically speaking, the reality is there, and they have to deal with it. And this is what I'm going to focus on later on. As I said, you have the same thing in French, you have the same variation in Arabic. Now, what does this mean? All of this means that linguistic competence no longer holds as such. Now we talk more and more about sociolinguistic competence, pragmatic competence, and recently we started talking about intercultural competence. And this is where we should really position the study of language at the moment. It should be considered in relation to culture, in relation to society, and and also within the broad framework of the theory of communication. A lot of research is being done in these various areas, and the results clearly show that we cannot really separate language from culture, from society, and from communication. And that's why we need a broader theory of language that brings together all these different elements. Now, there are two levels which we need to consider in sociolinguistics: the micro sociolinguistic level, which deals with language variation in interpersonal communication at a low level. And we also consider macro sociolinguistic variation, which considers language varieties in the broader picture, where we have major language varieties in communication among social groups, social classes, and even different cultures and different countries. So here we are now we moved from linguistic competence to intercultural competence. And when we talk about intercultural competence, we talk about verbal competence, my capacity as a speaker to speech, and my capacity to use paralanguage to convey my message. And we mean by paralanguage suprasegmentals, all the vocalics, and these include intonation, pitch, volume, and stress that come with verbal, our verbal competence. In addition to our verbal competence, we have non-verbal competence, non-verbal communication. And research shows that non-verbal communication accounts for 65% of the social meaning in a conversation. 65% of messages of our message is conveyed through non-verbal communication. And that's why it's very important for interpreters to see the people they're interpreting from or for. Otherwise, it's really difficult to get the entire message, as it were. And this is one of the challenges we are facing at the moment with Zoom interpreting. Now, non-verbal communication includes a number of components: semiotics, kinesics, haptics, chronemics, and proxemics. Sorry about all these eeks. Semiotics refers to the study of signs and how we use signs to communicate. Kinesics deals with body motion, which is extremely important. Face expression, eye contact, appearance also plays an important role, posture, and so on. Haptics, touching itself, is an important means of communication, and it's very important for interpersonal communication and social bonding. Now, in addition to verbal and non-verbal communication, we also have the capacity for cross-cultural communication. That is very much in demand nowadays, and this is the way forward. We are now moving more and more into cross-cultural communication to look at how best we can improve communication across languages and cultures. And obviously, with globalization, with greater facility for transport and travel around the world, now you have more and more contact between cultures and languages. But with that comes the need for understanding the rhetorical nature of other languages. It will not be easy for someone to translate from language A to language B without understanding the rhetorical structure of the language he's translating from, and the rhetorical structure of the language he's translating into. So he needs to know about the rhetorical cultural appropriateness of his translation. He needs to understand the type of argumentation developed. Sometimes when you translate an Arab speaker, it's very difficult, if you're not used to it, it's very difficult for you to understand the line of argumentation if you come from another culture, because Arab argumentation is repetitive and it tends to be circular, whereas in English rhetoric, the line is linear and more direct, so to speak. So we need to consider, as part of our cross-cultural communication competence, what to say, when, to whom, where, and how, and why. So we need to answer that particular question, and the answer to that question varies from one culture to another. So the exercise of translation is basically a cultural exercise. Now, for me, meetings, international meetings and meetings for interpreting, where interpreting is needed, are by definitions cultural contact contexts. For me, they are sociolinguistic events par excellence, where you will have, where people from different countries, from different cultures, from different linguistic backgrounds meet and to work, to do business, to discuss, or simply sometimes just to talk for the sake of talking. I did many meetings where people just talk and enjoy talking, but that also plays a function. It fulfills a function, it plays a role, and we have to take that into consideration. So for me, meetings are multi, and by definition, the interpreter is a multilingual communicator. He is also between different speakers from different linguistic backgrounds. So that's the nature of our community service, how we can translate our culture to other cultures and how we can facilitate communication between people from different cultures. And we play an important role. I think interpreters play an important role in the sense that they are there to promote, they are there to interpret for peace negotiations, they are there to achieve growth for the people concerned. So this is really a very noble humanistic mission that we need to take into account when you do this kind of job. It's not a job you do simply because you want to make money, although I have nothing against that. But we need to think of it as a mission, really. And it requires a great deal of passion and a great deal of understanding for other cultures. Now, interpreters are required to have a highly advanced knowledge and proficiency in the source and target language, but also they need to know about the cultures they are dealing with. Because language always comes in a package where culture plays an important role, where rhetoric plays an important role, where psychology also plays an important role, and we have to take that into account. So meetings are characterized by a great deal of language variation, where people speak different languages, and sometimes people speaking the same language do not speak it the same way. And there are differences between them. There is also cultural variation. Time management in a meeting is not perceived the same way by all the participants. This is an element that needs to be taken into account. Stylistic variation is not the same. And proficiency levels are not the same. Sometimes people claim they speak English, but they don't speak it really. But they do their best. They speak in English, or they may speak in Spanish or French or any other language, and they don't speak it well. Now, interpreters interpreting these speakers will find it extremely difficult to do their job. But this is something you have to live with. You have to deal with this. You have to deal with these different proficiency levels. Now, as I said, speakers have come from different linguistic backgrounds. They speak different standard varieties of English. Suppose you are doing a meeting for the African Union where you have the Nigerian delegation, Kenyan delegation. You probably have guests, the American, there will be another American delegation, British delegation, South African, to honor our friend from South Africa with us today. We can have speakers who speak English, but they speak it in different ways. And this is an issue, really, particularly when you are dealing with standards of English you are not familiar with. If you do a meeting in Bangladesh, where you will be dealing with South Asian English, and if you are not used to South Asian English, your job as an interpreter is going to be extremely difficult. I saw interpreters, in my experience, just give up on certain speakers. They wouldn't, they wouldn't be able to interpret them simply because they could not understand them. It doesn't mean that these speakers were not using standard English. They were using standard English with a heavy Bangladeshi accent. And sometimes that is mission impossible, really. So how should we handle this as interpreters? How should we handle this degree of variation in the languages we are working with? if you're not exposed, if you have not been exposed to this variation in language, your job as an interpreter is going to be really difficult. But you have to do it. You have to learn, you have to get used to other varieties of English, otherwise you won't be able to do your job adequately. I know that this comes with experience, expertise comes with experience, you become familiar, you are used to it. For instance, I myself have become quite familiar now with South African English. I remember a few years ago in 1994, 95, when I first went to South Africa, it was not easy at all. But now I got used to it. And it's exposure that is very important. So we need to consider the fact that speakers we translate, we interpret, come in a range from intelligible to unintelligible language used. And this applies to all the languages, English, Arabic, and French. Do not take, it's not because a speaker is Arab, he can speak Arabic, or he can give a good speech or deliver a clear speech. That does not always follow. The same thing happens, as I said earlier, in the case of English. Suppose you're doing a meeting for the American Army, and you have American Marines there discussing, I don't know, weapons and things like that. It's sometimes difficult for them to understand each other, let alone interpreters who have to, interpret from heavy Texan, dialect. Sometimes it's really difficult. It's really difficult to do your job properly. Now, the same applies to French, where you have Canadian French. I myself find it very difficult to understand Canadian French, and I had to deal with it at some point. Swiss French is not easy either, particularly when they go in their numbers, so you have to get used to that. I think the degree of performance by the interpreter in this case depends really on experience more than anything else. Because if you're not careful, then this can lead to misinterpretation and misunderstandings. So in meetings, you also need to consider that speakers have different social standings. They do not all enjoy the same status, and they do not all have the same power, or they belong to the same social classes, or they do not have the same level of government representation sometimes. In the same meeting, you may have delegates, you may have ministers, you have heads of state, you have a wide range of diversity of participants which you have to deal with. And I must recognize that sometimes participants do not know how to work with interpreters. They do not make our job easy. They actually make it more difficult because they don't know how to work with interpreters. In addition to problems of time management, you can have very bad speakers who will give you a speech that is not structured, ideas are not clear, some of them are thinking aloud, and it is very difficult for you as an interpreter. If you don't have a clear, structured intervention, it's very difficult for you to follow the line of thinking. And sometimes you have to deal with unclear presentations. People do not have the necessary skills to produce adequate PowerPoint presentations. You'll have to deal with crammed PowerPoint presentations where you can't really read anything, and they don't know how to alternate speech with the slide showing, and so on. So there can be serious difficulties we have to deal with, and our participants do not help sometimes. So there is, as I said, inadequate time management. And why is inadequate time management very important to us as interpreters? Because when speakers do not have enough time to express themselves, they have to rush through their presentations. Or they are stressed, and when they are stressed, we cannot do our job properly, and they will increase their reading speed. That does not help at all, and there will be a lack of rhythm in the whole presentation, which interpreters find it difficult to follow. And sometimes you have participants who don't even know how to handle their equipment, let alone their speech. Some will not switch on their microphones on time, or they don't know when they should switch them on, or they don't know when they should switch them off. So there can be a great deal of confusion caused by participants who are not familiar with the way we use with the way we deal with interpreters. And they carry on communicating as if we were not there at all. And this is one of the major difficulties that is very much recurrent in the African market that I'm very much familiar with. So we should also deal with situations where participants don't have a very adequate management of their own emotions. They become sometimes they are angry, they fight, they use undiplomatic language, loudness. It's common in African meetings for participants to interrupt each other, for sometimes two speakers to speak in the at the same time, particularly if you are dealing with training sessions or low-level meetings where participants do not have a high sense of hierarchy, then it is really a very difficult task indeed. And I did meetings where there, chaotic meetings where there is a lot of noise in the hall, people speaking at the same time. And if you have a lousy chairman who cannot control the meeting, then that is a major difficulty indeed. Interpreters also have to deal with culture from another perspective, and that is the culture of meetings. Do not expect all countries to have the adequate culture of meeting organization. You do meetings. You may do meetings that are completely disorganized. You don't get your documents on time. Very little respect for working hours. You're there and they think that the meeting can go on forever and they expect you to be in the booth. Lack of knowledge about the interpreting profession. And all these difficulties mean that people do not have the culture for sound meeting organization, including meetings with interpretation. Another big problem is language proficiency. It would appear that there is a great deal of pressure on participants, on experts, consultants, to use foreign languages. I understand it because they wanted to put this, because they put this in their own CV. And sometimes they pretend they can speak English, or they pretend they can speak Arabic or French, but they don't really speak it properly. And that leaves us with a problem. So you're not simply trying to decode the message. You're also trying to understand what this speaker, who's completely hopeless in English, is trying to say. Now, the listeners, your audience, doesn't know that the speaker is not proficient in English or in Arabic or in French. They would think that it is the interpreter who is not doing his job properly. But as interpreters, how can we give sense sometimes to nonsense? It's really difficult. I know we try hard. We restructure discourse. We put a lot of ourselves into what we say to make sense. Because if someone is not using the language adequately or does not know how to speak it, then it is really a major issue there. But this question of proficiency among participants is a big issue. I noticed that over the last few years, particularly, and there is a lot of pressure. There is a lot of pressure to use foreign languages, and particularly English, because everybody thinks that he or she can speak English these days. So that's a lot of pressure on us. So proficiency, all linguistics, lexicon, accent, pronunciation. So sometimes as an interpreter, you have to deal with language. I'm not talking about language variation in terms of standards, non-standards, or different standards, like American English or which. I'm dealing here with proficiency levels, which are sometimes very low, and participants don't realize this. Now, the question is, how should interpreters handle language variation? How should we deal with this? who are in this profession. If you want to work on English, please use one variety of English. Let's say British English or American or South African English, and work on it. And make sure you get that sort of accent or enough proficiency in that particular accent. There is nothing worse than missing different ways of pronunciation. That is not going to help you at all. The same applies to Arabic. Interpreters need to know exactly what type of Arabic are they going to interpret into. Is it going to be African? Is it going to be Middle Eastern? Is it going to be Gulf Arabic? Because there are differences there. I know an Algerian interpreter who translates in Egyptian Standard Arabic. But when I asked him once, why do you do that? He told me, because most participants have positive attitudes towards Egyptian Arabic. That's why I do that. So if I translate into Egyptian Arabic, they would think I'm probably a good interpreter. And then he would have less complaints from these Egyptian participants who most of the time are in large numbers in Arab meetings. Now, you need to choose a particular variety and work on it, develop it, entertain it, and maintain it. Now, but in any case, whatever variety you choose, my advice is to keep it clear and please pronounce, correctly, be clear, because nobody will blame you for being clear. Especially if you are working as a pivot for other languages, because you're not interpreting to your audience. Part of your audience is your colleagues who are taken over from you. So you have to give them very well organized messages, particularly when you are dealing with a participant who is not proficient. So you have to deal with that sort of situation. You need to expose yourself to other varieties of English, other varieties of Arabic, exposure to news channels, readings in different language varieties, listening to different TV channels. I myself, I regularly listen to the BBC, to Fox News and RFI on radio, just to maintain my French and English. So I do that almost on a daily basis. But you need to travel to countries where people speak English or to countries where people speak French to learn the language better. So the repeated exposure is going to be very beneficial. And I'm thinking about the students who are with us today. So my advice is to try to go to the UK or to the US and stay there for some time. That will be more beneficial than anything else. Now, how should now at the institutional level, how should interpreting schools handle language variation? Which standard variety to teach, particularly in the Tunisian context? I don't know about your policy, Hammouda, in your department, but which type of English are you going to teach? You must have a school policy on the matter. But when we say deciding on a standard language variety, we do not exclude exposure to other varieties. We should have both. And this applies not only to interpreting, but also to teaching as well. In the teaching profession, you always need models. Otherwise, people don't learn. I'm not in favor of a laissez-faire policy when it comes to language teaching or including interpreting. You cannot tell people, speak the way you want. Well, even if you have a heavy accent, that doesn't really matter. Everybody speaks with an accent. Or, there has been a great deal of laissez-faire in education and the teaching of English as a foreign language, or even the teaching of English as a native language. And that has probably contributed to the decreasing standards, educational standards we have, particularly in Africa. So you choose, in your policy, you need to have one standard language variety, but that you teach, but at the same time, you expose your students to stylistic variation, to different registers, to different types of text, to different types of speakers. So exposure is very important. Linguistic stays, as I said, are also important. And you need to train students by exposing them to different language varieties. If you are doing interpreting exercises, then obviously you'll have to bring in speakers who are not necessarily American or British. because our students will probably be dealing with people from Africa more than Europeans or Asians. But even then, you need to include that diversity in our curriculum. Otherwise, we won't be able to give our students the training they need. So this is what I wanted to talk about today. I tried to look at some key notions in sociolinguistics and how they apply to interpreting, and how we can use research in linguistics to train better interpreters. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Jabeur, for this very insightful presentation on the relationship between sociolinguistics, language varieties, and conference interpreting in particular, and for really making the transition from theory to practice very smooth and very elegant. Perhaps I would like to start by asking a question, and then I will open it up to the other participants. You said that sometimes you will be in a situation where you have to make sense or to nonsense. In this sense, perhaps I call these two acts of meaning making. You are making meaning of something that is not clear enough. So it is a meaning making. But there is another act by your audience also, and by you also, to do meaning milking, in the sense that it is an act of interpretation and another act of inferencing. So in the interpretation and inferencing, there will be some loss. There will be some unfaithfulness, perhaps, to the original message. In addition to the many hardships, obstacles you are facing towards making the message through and making the communication, which is tripartite, successful. So I would like you to dwell more, and I would like to have your thoughts on that, the loss, the idea of loss, and the space of freedom that the interpreter might have to go and interpret the message one way or another.
I would call this a case of minimal interpreting, in the sense that what you are getting as a message, you are getting a message that is not clear enough. So what you are trying to do, you improve it in the senses that you make sense of it. Obviously, we cannot be 100% faithful in that particular case. And the rule garbage in, garbage out does not really apply. And as an interpreter, there will be a lot of pressure on you, particularly among your colleagues, if you are working as a pivot, to give them something they can work with. Well, it is true that sometimes it's really difficult to do that, but at least you can structure it, you can give it a better order, you can organize it better. And I know it's more demanding on the interpreter, because then you need more skills. You need, first of all, experience, and you need more skills to put order into this particular type of message. But you have no other option. But in any case, you know, the message itself will not go through 100%, simply because you're not getting enough material to work with. But you improve it in the sense that you do not add, but you simply try to understand what the man, the speaker, is telling you, is saying, and you make sense of it that way.
Yeah. Thank you. So, dear participants, the floor is yours now. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment on this interesting conversation and presentation. I can see Wael bin Ali, and then Arish Rahal, Nada bin Aoun. Yes, let's start with Wael. You have the floor.
Hi, sir. Well,
Hi.
my question is about the cooperative principle in relation to interpreting. To be more specific, I'm going to talk about the Grecian maxims. You know that Grice argues that in order to fulfill a meaningful conversation, the speakers must obey and respect four maxims: maxim of quality, quantity, relation, and manner. But what if the speaker violate and flout these maxims? Do you think that it is among the responsibilities of the interpreter to fix these violations? For example, when the speaker drifts away from the main subject, the interpreter has to delete from the speech, or when the speaker is ambiguous, the interpreter has to make it clear. And my second question is about the presuppositions and implicatures. You know, sometimes the speaker presupposes that the interpreter knows things which is not the case. And sometimes the speaker implies things and the interpreter is clever enough or skilled enough to interpret these implicatures. And when the public don't like what the speaker says, the speaker can deny simply that he didn't say this. And I think that happens a lot of time. So
Okay,
thank you.
That's my main question.
Professor Jabeur, do you mind if we take 2 or 3 questions?
yes, yes.
Perhaps,
or we
I
can
know-
do it one. We can do it one question at
Yeah,
a
yeah.
time.
Go ahead, please.
It's better probably.
Better,
Make
yeah.
it interactive. Yes,
yeah.
We'll make it interactive this way. Yes. Now to answer the first part of the question on Grice's maxims, yes, they do apply to our to translation and interpreting, but you need to consider them in a cross-cultural situation, in a cross-cultural manner. What do I mean? If you take, for instance, the maxim of quantity, the maxim of quantity is not understood in Arabic and in English the same way. For instance, we Arabs in our rhetoric, we tend to use more words than let's say a British speaker would. So I myself, I was involved for a long period of time in the translation of Arabic documents from Arabic, obviously, to English with an organization based here in Tunis. And I was not the only translator involved. We were a team of 3 translators. There was an Iraqi translator with us, a British translator, and myself, and we were working on the translation of highly sensitive documents from Arabic into English. Now, the writers who wrote those documents complained most of the time because they would give us a document made, let's say, of 3-4 pages, and we give them back 2 pages only. And they say, what is happening? What happened to the rest? Did you translate all the pages? And people believe that translation is about quantity, that if you give them 3 pages, if they give you 3 pages, you must give them back 3 pages. And if you give them 1.5 pages, then it's a problem. But we had to explain to the people who, to the writers, that there are things you cannot say in English. You can say them in Arabic, but if you say them in English the way they are written in Arabic, that does not make sense.
Professor Jabeur, can you think of an example here of something that does make sense in Arabic but not in English?
This is true in the case of political texts. I was translating these documents for the Palestinians, and the Palestinians used a language that was highly militant, that was, very violent in some cases. And we kept telling the writers that this could be fine if your audience is an Arab audience, that's fine. But if you would give the text in its, let's say, bad translation, you will not have friends on the American side. You will be making more enemies, actually, because they would not get your message correctly. So what you can say in Arabic may not necessarily be easily understood by an American reader. So translation is about audience design. And it's also about the maxims indicated earlier on by the participant who asked the question. I don't know whether that is acceptable when it comes to the first part. Now the second part on implicatures, on intention, what is the speaker intending, obscure language, opacity in discourse. My friend, you have no other option. You have to deal with it. As an interpreter, you have to prepare for a meeting. You need to understand what is at stake in that meeting. If you don't understand the stakes, you won't be able to do your job properly. You need to have an idea about les enjeux. What is being cooked up in that meeting? What are people trying to say? Because there are so many things that participants don't say. So you need to have a clear idea about the unsaid in that meeting, or the things that are said in an opaque manner, in a diplomatic language, or sometimes in an indirect manner. But you need to know what is, the exact intention of the participants. And to do that, you need to prepare for the meeting, but also you need to be extremely involved in the meeting. So you sit in your booth and follow the debate.
Yeah.
That's how you deal with it.
Thank you, Professor. We received another question from Yum Sharafuddin. She said, quote, "May I ask a question here? Should the interpreter choose her stylistic variety depending on that of the speaker, or should they just use the formal standard variety anyway?"
Now, when it comes to style, you must translate formal English into formal Arabic, or formal Arabic into formal English. If you are doing a meeting of heads of state, you're not going to start using "gonna do this" and "gonna do that," and it's just not, rap music, rap, kind of language. You cannot do that sort of thing. You need to maintain the level of stylistic, adequacy. But obviously, you may be interpreting an artist or a singer who may be using non-standard English. But in that case, you try to keep your style as informal as possible.
Yep.
So you need to respect the maxim, if there is a maxim, the maximum of formality and formality.
Yeah. Another question by Ayman Tarhuni. Robin Lakoff talks about men and women belonging to different and separate subcultures. How does that affect the interpreter's performance when they interpret the opposite sex's speech? If a man translating a woman or vice versa?
That's a very good question. As an interpreter, I would do my best to interpret the message as I receive it, whether it comes from a man or a woman. Obviously, you do some adjustment when it comes to reference, with he, she, and, you've got to be careful with that sort of thing. But apart from that, well, it is true that in some meetings, I did, for instance, a large number of women's meetings where sometimes the message, and particularly feminist meetings, where there is a high spirit of, militancy among the participants, and you have to deal with the passionate forms of language and so on and so forth. But as an interpreter, you need to translate all of that, of course.
Let me give you a context here. For example, a context of in-camera hearings, and people or women, are telling their stories about violations perpetrated against them, especially rape. Some of the meetings, only female interpreters were required. But in that combination, there was no female interpreter available at that time. And they had to have recourse to a male interpreter. And there was a problem over there. So this will affect the original discourse. Women will not go far with telling the narratives as they wanted it to be shared because of the presence of a male interpreter. And also, it created another problem. A woman is telling her experience, a horrible experience, but the audience in English were listening to it with a male voice. So what are your thoughts on that?
It would be better in this particular case. It would be better to hire a female interpreter, but you're saying that it is not really possible to do that. I think a male interpreter can do it if, I think with enough experience and expertise, he can do that. So you do not necessarily need to have a woman to convey a message by another woman. Now, what you said in relation to whether this particular victim is comfortable with a male or a female interpreter, that's something else. That it would be better than to have a woman if that would make her feel more comfortable. But I think interpreters can handle these situations. You don't need to have a female interpreter to do a particular type of job.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to make an announcement to the participants. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please use that option of hand, the blue hand. Otherwise, I cannot see you well. I'm not seeing all of the videos. So perhaps you might be...
I don't have the blue hand.
Oh, you don't have a blue hand?
Screen.
So...
No, Hamid.
So I really, because I am an administrator here, I don't know where it is exactly. I think it is in réaction. Other students might help, like Arish, for example, she did it. Arish, can you take the floor, ask a question, and please tell us how to show that hand?
Okay, it's on participant.
Participant, okay.
Non. Plus. There is plus than abaisser ou laver la main.
Okay. It doesn't appear to me because I am the administrator and the host. So I don't need to show that hand. Did you get it?
No. I'm using the phone, so I can't.
Okay, so
Actually, can I help?
Please go ahead.
Okay, so if you're using your phone, I'm also using a phone. First, I would like to say hi to Professor Jabeur. So on the right hand, you have more. So you click on more, then you find raise hand, and you just click on it. Is it okay?
Professor Mansouri, did you get it? Anyway, I've taken note of your request, so we will sort it out perhaps later. So, Arish, you have the floor.
Hello, Professor Mohamed. Amid the coronavirus pandemic, we are facing a kind of infodemic where minority languages cannot have access to information. My question is, what are the new approaches or ways that can or have been adopted so far to make it possible for interpreters to reach and help the most marginalized languages, especially those who do not have a written language, such as the case with the Rohingya language? Thank you.
Now I understand that if information is not available in the minority languages, this can be a major difficulty for some minorities. So that is an issue, in my own understanding. It's an issue of translation and making the necessary information available in the minority languages. Now, there is a tendency to respect minority languages in a number of African countries. I know, for instance, in Senegal recently, they introduced minority language interpreting in the Senegalese parliament. and some of my friends were involved in training interpreters there. So there is this awareness of the need to make information, particularly information in these times of the pandemic, information available to these minority groups. It is a human rights issue, and I agree that it can be a major difficulty. Interpreters can help if, when they do their service, obviously, they can help disseminate that sort of information. But if you are talking about participation in, NGOs or associations to help on a volunteering basis, that is probably the way forward.
Yeah, thank you. Professor Mansouri, you have the floor. Okay, let's go to Dalal El-Ghamay.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we do. Sorry, Dalal.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Thank you. I was saying it's really a pleasure to be here with you and to see both of you, Dr. Salhi and Professor Jabeur, and the other attendees. There are a few things that I just thought I would add to addressing the working conditions, especially on the African continent. There's one thing that is related to provision of documents early enough, because these are things that do not belong so much to the interpreter, but they can impact the performance of the interpreter. So provision of documents early enough in the process. This is not a common tradition, I should say, in many African countries. The other thing is the role of the chair. Normally in meetings where you have a large audience listening to Arabic, it would be good to have a chair who is conversant in Arabic. This helps the interpreter a lot. There's also a lacking tradition in local markets. I mean, in Tunisia, for instance, you don't have team leaders, or you don't often have team leaders. You really need to have a team leader. It's the team leader who can walk into a meeting and tell a speaker, for example, to slow a bit down, or tell the chair that the session has been, has run for too long, and that they have to, be considered with regard to the interpreters and the stress that they are coping with. There are a few other things I'd like to add in relation to the training of interpreters. Most interpreters are trained in formal varieties, and they find it very difficult when a speaker shifts or a chair shifts in a meeting from, let's say, the standard variety to expressions of courtesy. Do we really train our interpreters to be courteous in the way they address others? Say, for example, we now announce a comfort break. It's not a toilet break. It's a comfort break. So, there are these things, I believe, that can contribute in having interpreters with around competence, as we say in Manar, around character. In order to, we really take these things into consideration. That was related to implication and whether the interpreter anticipates. Now, suppose a speaker says, إِنَّهُ كَبِيرُهُمْ, and stops. إِنَّهُ كَبِيرُهُم.
الذي علمهم السحر.
الذي علمهم السحر. So and they will stop. They will say إِنَّهُ كَبِيرُهُم, and they will stop. And it's up to you to introduce the magic and the black magic into it. That's it. This was my contribution. Thank you.
Professor Jabeur, can you hear us?
Yes, I agree. I agree with what Professor Mohamed said. It's true that we need to take into account this, the way we manage our meetings either locally or at the continental level. And I think a lot needs to be done to improve the quality of our meeting management. Also, time management is a big issue, as you all know. But I also agree with Mohamed when he says that we need to introduce in our training a clear definition of intercultural communicative competence. We need to train our interpreters to become better communicators. And this also applies not only to the training of interpreters, it applies to our TEFL training, EFL training, ESL training. All of them need to take into consideration this communication dimension, which unfortunately is not fully considered. I think we lost our moderator.
Sorry, I was speaking out of mic. I was unmuted. So Dalal, it's your turn. Sorry. And I was surprised why Dalal is not reacting. Yes, Dalal, you have the floor.
Dr. Hammouda. Thank you very much, Dr. Hammouda, for this very interesting
You're welcome.
encounter. And thank you very much, Dr. Jabeur. This is Dr. Dalal from Egypt. And actually, I do have a couple of comments to make. The first is related to what you said earlier about understanding interpretation as a sociolinguistic issue par excellence. Now, one of the major problems, especially if you are interpreting into Arabic, is the case of which variety of Arabic that you're using. And sometimes, me myself, at my early career as an interpreter, I was under the impression that using modern standard Arabic, that would be, the magic wand that would make you accessible, especially if your audience were a group of Arab people coming from all different parts, from North Africa, from the Gulf area, and so on. Until I came up with an experience where the audience were a group of variety of Arab-speaking people, and we were interpreting into modern standard Arabic, and then after the first couple of minutes, I had a lot of the audience coming up to me and saying that they had some kind of remarks about the lexical items that we were using because they were different. And it was then I realized that modern standard Arabic is not one homogeneous whole, as we all think it is. If you just take a quick look at the newspapers from Tunisia, Egypt, Gulf area, without knowing where that was published, you immediately realize that this has been published in, say, for example, in Lebanon, that was in the Gulf, that was in Egypt. So even that is not one homogeneous whole. And I think that students will probably need to be trained on that. Another issue, which is a very tricky issue, is when and how to use the colloquial dialects. And again, this is a very tricky issue. Again, from my own experience, I had one Irish speaker, and he had an excellent sense of humor. He was speaking to a group of Egyptian teachers, senior teachers, about how to upgrade their career and so on. And he had an excellent sense of humor and kept saying jokes and so on, and was a little bit frustrated when he couldn't see the people laughing. I immediately realized this, and he was a little bit frustrated. So we thought about another trick. Me and my colleague in the booth, and we decided that whenever he comes with a joke, that we would switch to Egyptian colloquial Arabic, and we will add our own phonological effects and so on. And the people started laughing, and the speaker started, oh my God, the joke is coming across, and the people are happy, and so on. So it's very tricky about when and how to use the colloquial variety, because in certain cases, it would be the best way, especially when you're telling jokes or you're speaking with people who you know are not very highly educated. I'm talking about, of course, my own experience in Egypt. and depending on how very well educated your audience is. And sometimes you can see that effect on the faces of people. You start using modern standard Arabic and the people feel that it is a little bit formal, the message is not coming across or so on. Then you would switch to another variety. It's very, very tricky. And I think that it's something that an interpreter would come up on the spot. I mean, you probably need to train your students about when and how to use it. But again, it will depend on the situation, the exact moment on which the interpreter would utilize when and how he would switch from one variety to the other.
Al-Ghami, thank you very
much. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very interesting question. Yes, I'm worried about time, and we have almost 10 minutes left. So do you mind, Professor Jabeur, if we add some 5 minutes?
Yes, of course, my pleasure.
Thank you very much. Over to you regarding this question, last question.
Oh, yes. I remember once I did a meeting, and this was a training session for Tunisian police and fire brigade. The speakers were American, and they were here to train our local police force, with regard to some security issues. Now, I was in the English booth, and there was we had also French booth and an Arabic booth. After the coffee break, they came to us, the organizers, and they said they didn't need French. There was no one was listening. No one needed French translation. And for the Arabic booth, they requested interpreting into Tunisian Arabic. And that's what we did, actually. My colleagues in the Arabic booth interpreted into the dialect of Tunisia. But that was the only time we had a specific request like this. But I understand that translating into a non-standard form can be very useful in the case of jokes and anecdotes, as you rightly indicated earlier on. But we need a lot of interpreting into non-standard Arabic or a non-standard language, particularly in the case of escort interpreting, where there is need for non-standard varieties.
Thank you. Lisa Saidi.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, doctor. So thank you for the very insightful course for today. So I have 2 questions. The first is to join the second question that was asked at the very beginning. So it was about matching the interpreter's language variation to the one of the speaker. But how about the audience? Should we, as an interpreter, consider the audience language variety? Because after all, I consider interpreting as role-playing somehow, and it should fulfill the audience of the needs of the audience. And my second question is about what should be considered less important when interpreting. For repetition and redundancy, for example, digressions from the main argument anecdote I have stated just before, and when the speaker is basically given a long list of illustrative examples and details that aren't very important, should the interpreter judge this as less important to be interpreted? And thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, by definition, a meeting is a formal speech event where participants and interpreters are expected to use a standard language variety. So we cannot really talk about the use of informal speech styles, etc., unless or non-standard language varieties, unless there is a specific request from the organizers, or when you have to accommodate to the style of the speaker himself. So you can do that sort of thing, but usually, normally, meetings are formal speech events and where formal styles are, of speech are used, irrespective of the language we're talking about. Now, to answer the second part of your question, a translator or an interpreter is not an editor. He should not reduce the message, nor add to the message. He can organize it. He can you know, come back to one point, and he can replace, reorder, because that's part of the, you know, our job. But you cannot edit the message you are receiving. You cannot take off some parts of it. You cannot take off some parts of it or add to it or distort it. No, you can't.
But how about if you receive a request from your client, and here it is a question of an ethical nature related to ethics. You are receiving a request not to translate that word by that word, despite the fact that you know that this is the equivalence. I'll give you an example. I've been translating for the two Sudanese delegations from the opposition before the toppling of President Omar al-Bashir, and they were speaking about, in Arabic, al-intifada. We are going to wage that intifada and so on. So intifada does exist in English, so the interpreters opted for two words, intifada or uprising. And then the client approached the interpreters during the coffee break and told them, please, please don't translate that word, either the intifada with intifada or with uprising, because we are trying to convince donor parties to finance that, and they really are skeptical now after hearing the word intifada. Are they financing armed factions or an armed uprising? So how do you deal with that, despite the fact that you know that this is the right word, and the interpreter taking into account also the needs of the audience, of his own audience, rather than the faithfulness, opting for the faithfulness to the original message?
Yeah, but which translation did they suggest?
Anything else? Just peaceful. She suggested, yes, and you have to say it this way.
Yeah,
okay?
yes.
Either peaceful uprising or just our struggle. That's all.
Yes, yeah. Well, you know, politics and ideology come into the picture. What can you do? Sometimes you can make a compromise, and I don't think that it is a very big issue here. You can say peaceful uprising if that is the case, but I would stick to the way I translate the word. I mean, I wouldn't change it. I don't think that is really appropriate.
Thank you.
Yes.
Dr. Layla Lakhwa, you have the floor.
Can you hear me?
We do.
Mohammed, how are you?
I'm fine. Thank you very much, Layla. Thank you.
See you.
Good to see you too.
Yeah, I just want to ask a very simple question. How do you handle jokes when the presenter is just giving a very formal presentation, and in the middle, just to want to be interactive, he inserts a joke and he switches to colloquial language, and the joke you should make you laugh, and then you try your best and the audience don't laugh. So what do you do in this case?
Jokes are the interpreter's nightmare. Not much you can do about it. It's you either get it or you don't get it. You remember the anecdote about this interpreter who could not translate a joke, and he said in his microphone, "Please laugh, I don't understand the joke." And everybody laughed. So yeah. Now to just a minor comment on the previous discussion. Please. On the previous discussion, I remember when Gaddafi was the leader, of Libya, he insisted on the translation of his title as leader, not president. And he wanted to be called brother leader. And he used to follow, to monitor the interpretation. And it may happen sometimes an interpreter says, you know, President Gaddafi or something, and he would go angry simply if you say that. So that's one of the things I learned. Always say leader Gaddafi, but now he's gone. So it's okay.
Yeah, he's gone. So, and in relation to the last question by Dr. Lechwa, I've been told that in the European Court of Justice, they have sent a very clear message for the speakers and delegates not to tell jokes, because they are translating for almost 26 or 27 languages, and you will be having laughters. Now, for example, the Germans will laugh, and then after 1 minute, the French, and then etc. So it was a policy that they have adopted not to tell jokes and not to translate jokes. Thank you. So we have Sarah Tabli.
Yes, sir, here I am. First of all, thank you for professors for all your lectures and all. So Jabeur, sir, you already talked about the different ways of speaking English. And yes, I can understand that, like British English or American one or Australian and all. Now my question is regarding the Arabic language. You said that an interpreter should know like all sorts of Arabic. So what do you exactly mean by that? Like, do you mean that the interpreter, a good interpreter, should know the different dialects and be able and ready as well to interpret all of them and into them? Or do you mean that, because sometimes we know that in the same country we can find different dialects? Or do you mean the different pronunciation of the Arabic letters, for example, like we find Egyptians sometimes, they pronounce, for example, the letter dal in Arabic like zay. They say, instead of saying kadhalika, they say kazalika. And yeah, this is my question.
Yes. Now, as an interpreter, it is desirable to be familiar with as many dialects of Arabic as possible. Because in international meetings, you will have Arab participants who come from different Arab countries. And the more accents you're familiar with, the better. So this is the point I'm making, is that you need to develop this exposure to other dialects of Arabic and to other standards of Arabic. For instance, I find speakers from Gulf countries sometimes difficult to understand because they read their documents too fast, extremely fast compared to other Arab speakers. And that sometimes leaves me with a problem. So but you get used to it with the time, and you are prepared for this kind of, fact. But in any case, the more dialects, the more standard varieties you are familiar with, the better.
Yeah.
Or you as an interpreter.
Yeah. Hint? Perhaps the last question. Yes. Hi.
It's always nice to see you. I would like to ask you, how can we interpret idioms and metaphors, especially when they have a cultural background related to them? Thank you.
Thank you.
There are idioms and metaphors that are almost cliches, that used by participants here and there. So there are idioms that are widely used and there is no problem with translating them. But there are times when a speaker comes up with a metaphor you don't know about. Your best bet is to try to render the meaning of that metaphor, or you won't be able to give, the equivalent of that particular metaphor in the target language, but you still do your best to convey the meaning.
Good, thank you. Perhaps last question. I think I've seen one in the chat. Okay, I'm going, yes, I think that's all. So, Professor Jabeur, thank you very much for this very insightful presentation and this very rich and enjoyable discussion about the conference interpreting in particular and the socio-linguistic factors that come into play when exercising interpreting. I'm really very grateful to you for accepting the invitation, for being our guest speaker in this encounter at the shores of translation and, of course, interpreting and conference interpreting. You have taken us in a journey through some theoretical background on sociolinguistic background and the production of language, the language varieties, the other issues related to the monolithic entity or entities of language, social groups, stylistic variation, and the micro and the macro level of language. So, and the verbal and non-verbal communication. And then you moved very smoothly, as I said earlier, to give us tips about how to handle those challenges related to language and the socio-linguistic perhaps obstacles or conditions. Thank you very much for that presentation, and thank you also for showing modesty.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is not all. We still have another encounter around 5 p.m. Tunis time with another guest speaker. Reem Hassan from the University of Cambridge. She is also Tunisian, and she will be speaking about women's translation of the Quran. So I will see you there. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
And take good care of yourselves. Bye.
Thank you.